Welcome back to BLOCKTV. This is Links in the Chain. Now, with blockchain comes a lot of software. And who powers that software but the core developers? Joining us today is Tim Beiko, Ethereum core dev at Consensus. Tim, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's start off. What is Pegasus?
Yeah, so Pegasus is the protocol engineering group of Consensus. Consensus is a large company that builds protocols and application on Ethereum. And our group at Pegasus focuses on that core base layer of the blockchain, so really the protocol level. And we both build products and do R&D for basically every flavor of Ethereum you have. So we work on the Ethereum mainnet that is live today. We're also doing a lot of R&D for Ethereum 2.0, which is the next big iteration of Ethereum. And we also work on permission networks. So enterprises that want to set up a private Ethereum network amongst themselves.
Well, you mentioned enterprise applications and blockchains. Is Ethereum the best blockchain for enterprise applications? And if so, why?
So my biased opinion is that yes, it is. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So I think Ethereum is the blockchain platform where you really see the largest amount of innovation. And this comes from the fact that it has the largest, and I'd say probably most competent, both developer and researcher community. So a lot of the new ideas and new concepts in blockchains tend to be developed on Ethereum. And a couple we've seen in the past are things like, obviously smart contracts have been popularized, things like ICOs and crowdfunding on the blockchain, and as well as more recent things like stable coins and decentralized finance. And so on one hand, you have that pretty innovative ecosystem. And then on the other hand, there's also a lot of efforts with regards to enterprise adoption on Ethereum. So I think the most well-known of these is the Ethereum Enterprise Alliance, which is basically a group of companies that come together to try and define a specification for how enterprises can use Ethereum. Historically, it was more on the permission network, so they're trying to build a private network amongst themselves. And more we're seeing interest from those enterprises to use the Ethereum mainnet as the platform becomes more mature and more reliable. So just recently, the EEA has launched a main networking group.
So especially when it comes to enterprises actually using the Ethereum mainnet, how does the switch from proof of work to proof of stake, which we've been hearing about for so long, Ethereum 2.0, when that actually happens, how will that affect enterprises that are actually using the mainnet and also using private blockchains as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the first bit for the enterprises that are using mainnet, what's important to understand with the transition to Ethereum 2.0 is it's going to happen gradually. So there'll be different phases for the transition. And as that happens, it'll become easier and easier to switch over until at the very last stage, it's basically automatic. So if you're an enterprise that you're interested in staking and you really want to get on Ethereum 2.0 as soon as possible, you'll be able to do that, but there's going to be kind of a higher technical barrier. But if you're on the more conservative side and you just want your app that's already live on mainnet to keep working as is, then you can keep it on the Ethereum 1.0 chain for a little longer. And then once Ethereum 2.0 has been more battle tested, that chain will be moved over. And that'll be a much smoother transition. So there's really a wide range of options for people who have already deployed and that want to move to 2.0.
Now, for those who haven't already got onto the blockchain, which industries do you think would benefit the most from enterprise blockchains?
Yeah. So I think you want to break this between like near term and long term. And near term, we've seen a lot of adoption already from financial use cases. And I think the reason there is just there's a lot of financial use cases that happen on mainnet on Ethereum. And those are kind of easier to map to actual enterprise use cases. So obviously it takes a lot of work to convert kind of what's being built on mainnet to something that meets all the enterprise standards. But the sort of conceptual jump is not too big. And we've also seen similar adoption with things like entertainment and gaming, where there's a lot of activity around collectibles on the blockchain and those types of things. So I'd say in the short term, those are probably the industries that are kind of most ready and where the tech has already kind of proven that there's value, at least on mainnet. And I think if you look in the medium to long term, then you start to get into things like supply chain, healthcare, and government services, all of which are large industries that tend to move a little bit slower, but that would gain a lot from having this kind of central settlement platform that people can just use and trust and port across various providers.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the opportunities and the benefits provided by the blockchain to a lot of these industries that you spoke about, are obvious to people like us who know and understand the technology. But when you're dealing with the businesses, what is the number one reason that businesses say no when you try to pitch them on the blockchain?
So I think there's a few, right? Like I think you have to be willing to experiment and try to see what can blockchain actually do today for you? What will it be able to do in 3 to 5 years? And how do you get there? And I think a lot of the businesses that kind of say no or aren't really that interested, I think they're probably waiting until something is a bit farther developed. Whereas the company that we get to work with today, because they're willing to kind of take on this risk and work in this space a bit earlier, they can also help shape the direction of the technology. And that's been super, super important for us. Like I mentioned, the Ethereum Enterprise Alliance, and getting all those companies there to say, this is what we need with regard to privacy. This is what we need with regard to access to the system and whatnot. It really helps keep those concerns in mind as the technology gets developed. So yeah, the short answer, I'd say that the companies that really say no today, they don't want to invest, in helping to develop the tech, whereas a lot of the ones that are willing to take that risk will help kind of shape it for the future to come.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you mentioned, Ethereum has a wonderful dev community as well as user base, both enterprise and on their mainnet. In your view, will blockchain widespread adoption? Will it go enterprise to consumer? Or will it be a more bottom up where it'll be, the consumers will be using the blockchain and loving it and then slowly make its way into enterprise?
So I think what we've seen so far is the adoption running from consumer to enterprise. And what I mean by that is you look at a lot of the enterprise use cases that work and that have traction today, and they're kind of a variation on something that got developed on the consumer side and kind of got adapted to enterprises. The one recent example is things like stable coins, right? There's been a lot of sort of decentralized stable coins built on Ethereum, and now you're seeing more and more interest from governments, financial institutions, companies to issue their own kind of more regulated stable coins. I think you look at things like decentralized finance, that's very popular now on the Ethereum mainnet. And I wouldn't be surprised that in like 12 to 24 months, you start seeing that on the enterprise side. How can we take this innovation and leverage it as well? And so I think it's not as much because there's so many consumers that use these products, but just because the Ethereum mainnet right now is able to kind of serve as a proof of concept to show what's possible. And then enterprises can kind of take that concept and add whatever requirements they have to it for it to run in their environment, and go with that. So I think, yeah, we've definitely seen from consumer to enterprise so far.
Mm-hmm. Now, we can't speak about Ethereum without speaking about hard forks. And I know you had a heavy hand in Istanbul. You're heavily involved in it. Now, a lot of people who might not be familiar with the technologies, they kind of hear hard forks, they think it's kind of a bad thing, it's a splitting, but in reality, it's a software update, and usually when everyone's on board with it, things go smoothly. But in your experience, definitely in this decentralized, game we're dealing with, what's the toughest part of pulling off a hard fork?
Yeah, so I think historically, the toughest part was just the fact that there would be an upgrade. And I think this comes from Bitcoin, which has this culture of not having hard forks. So every time Bitcoin had a hard fork in the past, it was usually to fix some critical bug. So over time, you kind of get this connotation that hard forks are to fix this terrible thing. Whereas Ethereum kind of by design knew it would always have to be upgraded. And so we've started calling them network upgrades instead of hard forks in Ethereum to reflect this kind of more, I guess, the fact that this process is to be expected. I think that the hardest part around them is we need to make sure, like you said, that there is broad community agreement around these changes. Because the last thing you want is for people to disagree strongly with changes and then to go off and fork and create their own network, which doesn't include those changes. And so I think that's really been the biggest part. How can we just make sure that whatever is being developed kind of gets shown to the community, gets approved, obviously gets debated, and that when we upgrade, we have things that we know there's broad consensus for. And the EEA has been working recently to try and give enterprises a voice in this process as well. So historically, it's been more the developer community that's been involved in this. But I think as enterprise interest has grown, it's great to get their thoughts on what they think is a good change that can be implemented in an upgrade.
I'm glad you brought up that point, because as consumers, we're always excited for the new upgrade, the latest edition, new things. But when it comes to enterprises and businesses, they like stability. They're still running, Windows 7 because it works and they know it. So when it comes to hard forks in enterprises, especially whether it's a permission blockchain or even just the mainnet, do enterprises get spooked by these hard forks? Maybe something goes wrong, maybe it doesn't play nice with their code and things will kind of break down?
So for the private network sides, because they're not following mainnet, they don't have to apply every hard fork, right? They can really pick and choose what they want to apply. And over time, they can also just have a delay, right? If they want to follow what mainnet is doing, but say have a 6 to 12 month delay to make sure that things are actually working, that's not things breaking, they can absolutely do that. And I think that's what we've seen so far, where a new permission chain that starts will kind of start from the most recent version of Ethereum, and then they might be a bit slower to apply the upgrades than mainnet is. And I think for companies building on mainnet, if they're managing their own nodes, obviously this is something they want to be aware of and set up the proper infrastructure around. But more and more, there's also services that will manage your nodes for you and kind of take that risk off your hands. And in terms of the applications that they built, there's a lot of best practices to make sure that even if a hard fork changes something, you'll still be able to keep your application running. And at Pegasus, we're happy to work with enterprises to kind of walk them through that process.
Mm-hmm. Well, Tim, as a consumer and a user, I often only get to see, kind of the outside, but thank you for joining us and explaining to us what kind of happens under the hood, behind the scenes, definitely when it comes to Ethereum and its hard forks, as well as enterprise uses. Thank you so much for joining us. And for all our viewers at home, if you want more on Ethereum, blockchain, cryptocurrency, and tech news, make sure to check us out at blocktv.com.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.